And you'll pay for it now!
What if I told you that the British Navy's most terrible battle was not fought against an enemy squadron, but within a single crew on a deserted island? This story shatters the romantic myth of noble captains and loyal sailors, revealing the true face of man in the face of imminent death. We are used to hearing about victories and conquests, but the Admiralty archives remain silent about what happened on the rocks of Patagonia. Where civilization ends, ranks and subordination disappear, giving way to primitive survival instincts. The majestic frigate turned into a pile of wreckage, and the disciplined crew became two warring gangs, ready to destroy each other for a sip of water. This story is not about naval battles, but about the collapse of human morality under the pressure of hunger and despair. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a handful of people managed to make an impossible journey of 3,000 miles in a frail boat, defying death itself. I discovered this by accident while studying old ship logs, and this detail struck me. The story of Commodore George Anson's expedition began with incredible pomp and ambition that did not match the reality of the situation. In words, it was a grand campaign designed to strike at the Spanish Empire at the heart of its Pacific possessions. The British Crown dreamed of demonstrating its superiority and capturing galleons filled with silver and gold. But behind the glittering exterior lay chaos, oversight, and a lack of real preparation. The true picture was far from the solemn speeches on the waterfront where the ships were seen off. The ships of the squadron were manned not by professional sailors of the fleet, but by random people who had been hastily assembled. Recruitment took place wherever it was possible to find anyone capable of standing on their own 2 feet. Press services grabbed people off the streets, taking away the poor, vagrants, and debtors, who were not told where they were being taken. The frigate Wager, which became the hero of our tragedy, was not even a real warship to begin with. It was an old East India Company merchant ship, worn out by years of sailing between India and Europe. It was hastily refitted with cannons and reinforced decks, but such measures could not replace a full-fledged military design. The holds were filled with goods for trade with the natives, tools, gifts, and supplies, which greatly weighed down the hull. Slow-moving and overloaded, the ship was difficult to steer and was not ready for the harsh conditions of the southern seas it was about to traverse. Captain David Chipp, who took command of the ship, was a man of morbid ambition and strict principles. He dreamed of glory that could open the doors to high society and saw the expedition as his last chance to change his fate. Chipp firmly believed that discipline and willpower could overcome any difficulties, and therefore did not want to notice the obvious problems. He ignored the advice of more experienced sailors and even refused to discuss the ship's shortcomings. For him, the very fact of participating in the expedition seemed more important than the actual condition of the crew in the ship. The officer corps was also a remarkable mix of characters and destinies. On board were experienced officers who had been on many long voyages, but alongside them served very young midshipmen who were stepping onto a ship's deck for the first time. There were constant arguments between them about how to steer the ship and how to act in difficult situations. Among the officers, Gunner John Bulkeley stood out in particular, a man with an observant mind and a tendency to write everything down in detail. He kept a diary almost every day, recording the details of life on board and the problems that arose, and it was his notes that would later become one of the most important sources of information about the fate of the Wager. When the squadron left its native shores, no one could have imagined that the main enemy would not be the Spanish fleet, but nature itself. The people on board dreamed of getting rich by seizing Spanish treasures and thought it would be just another adventure. Preparations for the expedition were carried out in such a hurry that mistakes were made at literally every turn. Supplies were checked superficially, and as a result, many barrels of provisions were spoiled. Rotten crackers, meat with worms, and barrels of water with insect larvae floating in them were found in the hold. The equipment also proved unsuitable for long voyages through the cold and stormy waters off the southern tip of America. The negligence of the officials and contractors responsible for the preparations was the first nail in the coffin of the Wager's crew. The ship itself, overloaded with cannons, gifts, and trade goods, sat too low in the water. This made it extremely vulnerable even to moderate storms, and in the Cape Horn area, it was a deadly threat. High waves washed over the deck as if trying to drown the ship with the force of nature. Any poorly secured object could instantly turn into a dangerous projectile, sweeping people off their feet. Engineers and shipwrights warned of this risk, but no one cared, because the main goal was wealth. No one paid attention to the grim omens that experienced sailors saw in literally everything. They warned that the ships had been assembled too hastily, that the crew had been poorly recruited, and that the route chosen was too dangerous. But the fleet's desires were directed in only one direction: westward, where the untold riches of the New World lay hidden beyond the horizon. The campaign against the Spanish seemed a matter of honor, and doubts were considered a sign of weakness. Ambition clouded the mind, and no one saw that the expedition was rushing toward its own destruction. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think it is possible to justify risking the lives of hundreds of people for the sake of a vague hope of wealth for the state? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what really happened when passing Cape Horn? Sailors call this place a graveyard for ships, and Anson's squadron learned the truth of this name firsthand. When the ships approached the southernmost point of America, the ocean turned into a boiling cauldron of icy water and foam. Constant dampness and cold penetrated every corner of the ship, making the crew's life unbearable torture. People slept in wet clothes, unable to warm themselves, as it was too dangerous to light a fire. The wood began to rot and the iron to rust, but the most frightening thing was what began to happen to the people. An unknown disease, which we now know as scurvy, began to mow down the sailors at a terrifying rate. People were visibly weakening, their skin was covered with spots, and old wounds suddenly reopened. Those who had been on watch yesterday could not even get out of their hammocks today. Captain Chip, despite his illness and exhaustion, tried to keep the squadron in order and keep up with the flagship. He demanded the impossible from his crew, forcing exhausted men to hoist sails and maneuver in stormy seas. His stubbornness caused grumbling, but discipline was still maintained by fear and habit of obedience. At some point, amid the raging chaos, the Wager lost sight of the rest of the squadron. Left alone in the midst of the raging elements, the ship became a toy in the hands of the ocean. The navigation instruments failed, and no one knew exactly where they were. The captain made a fatal mistake, believing that they had already rounded the Cape and entered the open ocean. He ordered the ship to head north toward the rendezvous point, unaware that the current was carrying them straight toward the rocky shore. This navigational error proved decisive in the fate of the ship. Fog and rain obscured the horizon, making it impossible to see the approaching danger until the very last moment. When the lookout finally saw the breakers, it was too late to change course. The ship was inexorably carried onto the underwater rocks. Watch the video to the end to find out how one miscalculation led to a disaster that divided the lives of the survivors into before and after. The secret that will change your perception of survival is that disaster often does not happen instantly, but stretches out over agonizing hours. It is not like a sudden explosion or a lightning strike of fate, as is often shown in movies. In reality, disaster creeps up gradually, step by step, forcing people to live through every minute of horror. In the early morning of May 14, 1741, as the crew began to wake up, the keel of the Wager crashed into underwater rocks off the coast of Patagonia with a monstrous screech. The impact was so strong that people were thrown from their bunks and heavy objects fell from the shelves and flew across the deck. The rudder was instantly torn off and carried away into the sea, depriving the ship of its only chance to navigate the raging ocean. The ship did not sink immediately. It was stuck between the rocks like a trapped animal. It was defenseless against the giant waves that crashed into the hull again and again, methodically breaking the wooden beams. With each blow, the planks creaked, and water filled the holds faster and faster, flooding the lower decks where the sick, wounded, and weak were located. They could not get out on their own, and their cries mingled with the sound of water filling the room. Panic quickly spread among the crew, and the strict discipline of the British Navy collapsed in an instant, giving way to fear and chaos. Some sailors, driven mad by terror, lost control and broke into the liquor stores, realizing that there was almost no time left. They began to drink right on the sinking ship, as if trying to dull their consciousness and drive away their fear for at least a few minutes. Drunken shouts and songs echoed across the decks, mingling with the roar of the waves and the creaking of the collapsing hull. They ransacked the officers' cabins, taking whatever they could, deciding to meet death in a state of complete indifference to everything. It was a terrifying sight of the moral decay of people who no longer saw any hope of salvation. The officers tried to organize the lowering of the boats, but the elements played with them like toys. The strong surf smashed the boats against the sides of the ship, turning them into splinters before the people had time to get into them. Water flooded everything around, and any delay could cost lives. Only through incredible effort did the crew manage to lower a barge and a yawl to transport the survivors to shore. But there were too few boats, and no one was willing to give up their place. A fierce struggle began for the right to leave the dying ship, and despair drove people to acts they would never have considered before. Those who made it to shore were no luckier. They found themselves on a windswept, rocky island in the pouring icy rain. Water ran down their clothes, their hands trembled from the cold, and their legs could barely hold them after a long struggle with the elements. The people were wet, frozen, and completely unprepared to survive in such conditions. They had no shelter, no food supplies, and no clear understanding of where they were or how far away the nearest human settlement was. Each of them hoped that the shore would give them a respite, but it turned out to be only a new stage of trials. Captain Ship, who had been injured in the crash, was brought ashore by people who were just as exhausted as he was. He tried to take command, as his duty demanded, but it was too late. His authority remained there, on the deck of the wrecked frigate, along with the maritime code and faith and order. The people who had obeyed his orders just yesterday now looked at him with distrust and hidden anger. Many believed that it was his decisions that had led them to disaster, and no longer saw him as a leader. The night after the crash was a real test that even the strongest barely endured. The people who found themselves on the shore without a fire were forced to lie close together to keep warm, but the icy wind penetrated any clothing. Many died of hypothermia before dawn, their bodies cooling among the boulders. The cries of those who remained on the sinking ship continued to be heard through the sound of the surf, as if the sea itself were mourning the doomed. These sounds haunted the survivors and robbed them of sleep, reminding them that their rescue was only relative. The next day, when the storm subsided a little, desperate attempts began to salvage at least some of the supplies from the wreckage of the ship. Daring men risked their lives to return to the wreckage in the hope of obtaining a barrel of biscuits, a box of gunpowder, or tools. Anything that could still be salvaged was now worth more than gold, because without it, survival was almost impossible. Some returned empty-handed, others struggled to drag heavy barrels, exhausting their last ounce of strength. Each such trip was a duel with death, and not everyone returned. The shore was littered with broken masts, sails, and the bodies of dead comrades that no one could bury. The sea continued to wash up new debris, as if to emphasize the scale of the destruction. This picture of complete chaos, despair, and silence after the storm became the new reality for the 140 people who found themselves trapped. They were abandoned at the edge of the world, far from any sea routes, with no hope of imminent rescue. Now they had to live in a world where every day could be their last, and there was no way back. Like this video if you admire the resilience of people who are able to persevere even in such hopeless situations. What if everything you've been taught about the nobility of sailors is outdated? The island they were washed up on was completely uninhabitable. Bare rocks, swamps, and impenetrable thickets of shrubs. Constant rain turning to wet snow and piercing winds made life here unbearable. The first few days were spent in a frantic search for food, as very little had been salvaged from the ship. People ate whatever they could find: shellfish, seaweed, the roots of unknown plants, and even boiled shoe leather. Hunger became a constant companion, turning people into shadows of their former selves. They built primitive tents and huts out of sailcloth and mass debris, which provided poor protection from the weather. The camp resembled a slum where unsanitary conditions and hopelessness reigned. The officers tried to live separately, maintaining the appearance of hierarchy, but hunger made everyone equal. Conflicts flared over every little thing: a stolen cracker, a dry spot by the fire, or a plank found on the shore. People began to form small groups, protecting their meager resources from the rest. Trust disappeared, giving way to suspicion and aggression. Captain Chip continued to insist that they remained a military crew and must obey the rules. He demanded that the chain of command be maintained and planned to repair the boat so that they could continue their combat mission. To many, this demand seemed insane in the current situation. In opposition to him, Gunner Bulkeley and other officers began to openly discuss rescue plans that contradicted the captain's orders. They understood that going north to the Spanish was suicide or captivity. They saw their only chance as returning through the Strait of Magellan. Looting became commonplace. The strong took food from the weak, not shying away from violence. Those who were sick or wounded were doomed to a slow death, as no one wanted to share their last morsel with them. Moral foundations crumbled with each day of starvation. Attempts at hunting or fishing were rarely successful due to a lack of equipment and skills. The island's nature was sparse and hostile to uninvited guests. It seemed as if the earth itself was trying to get rid of the people. In this hell, two distinct camps began to form, with opposing views on the future. The tension between the captain's supporters and the group of malcontents grew like a boil ready to burst. The air was electrified with a sense of foreboding. Are you ready to find out how hunger and fear can drive people to turn against those they swore to protect? In this chapter, there is no room for speculation, only the bare facts about the confrontation between two wills. On one side was David Chip, an aristocrat and career officer who believed fervently in the immutability of his authority. He believed that even on a desert island, he remained the representative of the king and the law, with the right to dispose of the lives of his subordinates. On the other side was John Bulkeley, a man of the people, a pragmatist and experienced sailor who valued survival above the rules. He was greatly respected among the ordinary sailors, as he was always honest with them and shared all the hardships. Bulkeley understood that blindly following the captain's orders would lead to everyone's demise. The conflict escalated when Chip shot one of the midshipmen, suspecting him of conspiracy. This murder, committed in front of everyone, finally undermined the captain's authority. People saw him not as a leader, but as a dangerous tyrant who had lost touch with reality. Bulkeley began secretly gathering like-minded people around him to discuss a plan of action. He appealed to maritime law, arguing that after the ship's demise, the payment of wages would cease, and therefore the contract with the captain would become void. It was a legal loophole that justified insubordination. Chip tried to maintain control by using threats and the remaining alcohol supplies to bribe those loyal to him. He lived in his own separate tent under the protection of Marines, fearing an assassination attempt. The camp was effectively divided into two warring factions, ready to tear each other's throats out. Bulkeley's supporters set about lengthening the ship's barge, turning it into a small schooner. They worked day and night, seeing this boat as their only ticket home. The captain sabotaged this work, insisting on capturing a Spanish vessel. Every day there were verbal exchanges that escalated into skirmishes. Everyone now carried weapons and no one parted with them, even in their sleep. The atmosphere of mutual hatred poisoned life more than hunger. Bulkeley drafted a document detailing the reasons for his disagreement with the captain and a plan to return via the Strait of Magellan. This manifesto was signed by most of the survivors, effectively deposing Chip. It was a democracy of despair, born at the edge of the world. The captain refused to recognize the document, calling its signatories mutineers and traitors. He threatened everyone with the gallows upon their return to England. But his threats no longer frightened anyone. The fear of death on the island was stronger than the fear of trial. The situation reached a boiling point when it became clear that there would not be enough supplies for everyone. A decision had to be made: stay and die with the captain, or leave and save themselves. The choice was obvious to most. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as a dangerous precedent of insubordination. One morning, a group of armed sailors led by Bulkeley stormed into Captain Chip's tent. They declared him under arrest for the murder of the midshipman and his inability to lead the rescue of the crew. It was a strange mutiny, without bloodshed, with all formalities observed and protocols followed. Bulkeley and his supporters emphasized that they were not rebels, but were forced to act to save the lives of His Majesty's subjects. They even left the captain his personal weapons and some of his supplies. The captain was tied up but treated with respect, even though he showered them with curses. His accusations of treason sounded threatening, but they had no power here on the wild shore. Power passed to those who could offer a real plan of action. The mutineers' main achievement was the launch of a rebuilt bark, which they named Speedwell. It was an engineering marvel. From the wreckage of the frigate, they had created a vessel capable of withstanding an ocean crossing. They loaded most of the salvage supplies onto it. Bulkeley's group decided to leave the captain and several of his loyal men on the island. They gave them a small yawl and a meager supply of provisions, considering this a sufficient show of mercy. It was a cruel but pragmatic decision. It was impossible to take the irreconcilable commander with them. On the day of departure, a dramatic farewell took place on the shore. Those who were leaving felt guilty, but also relieved. Those who remained cursed the departing, realizing that their chances of survival were close to zero. The Speedwell was overcrowded. It held more than 70 people who sat close together. Conditions on board were terrible, but it was better than a slow death on the island. They set sail and headed south toward the Strait of Magellan. This moment became the point of no return. Now each of the participants in the events was personally responsible for their own fate. They ceased to be the crew of the Royal Fleet and became simply a group of survivors. The story of the captain's arrest became a unique case in the history of the fleet. Usually mutiny ended in the gallows, but here the rebels were confident in their righteousness. They carried documents confirming the necessity of their actions. Watch the video to the end to find out what hell those who dared to challenge the ocean in a small, overcrowded boat had to go through. The voyage on the Speedwell became one of the most incredible navigation stories of all time. The boat was so overloaded with people and supplies that its sides barely rose above the surface, leaving only a few inches above the water level. Any large wave could sink the vessel in one blow and bury everyone beneath it. Each of the survivors understood that they were literally traveling on the edge of destruction. Water seeped through the planks, and the sailors had to endlessly bail it out with helmets and mugs to keep the boat from sinking. People sat huddled together, unable to stretch their legs or change position for days on end. There was no luxury of movement. Every inch of space was taken. Sleep became a torment, possible only while sitting, in fits and starts, amid the constant cries, coughs, and moans of neighbors. Their backs and legs ached so much that they lost track of time. Sanitary conditions were appalling. The stench was so bad that many lost consciousness, and diseases spread faster than anyone could cope with. Any injury became life-threatening. They were crossing the Strait of Magellan, one of the most dangerous places for navigation on the planet. These waters were known for their treacherous currents, capable of turning a boat upside down in the blink of an eye. Sudden squalls struck without warning, and the icy wind cut through the skin like a knife. Every minute, they balanced between life and death. Bulkeley navigated almost by touch, as he had neither accurate maps nor reliable instruments. He navigated by the stars, the habits of local winds, and his own experience. Hunger on the boat was even worse than on the island. Their daily ration consisted of a handful of flour, sometimes mixed with a small amount of fat, if they could find it. This mixture resembled a paste, which was barely enough to keep them going. People were literally wasting away before our eyes, becoming shadows of their former selves. They died of exhaustion right where they sat, without even the strength to call for help. The bodies of the dead were carefully lifted and thrown overboard, freeing up a little space in the overcrowded boat. Discipline was hanging by a thread, and even minor quarrels could escalate into fights over tiny portions of food or water. People became irritable, aggressive, and unpredictable. Bulkeley had to be tough to prevent chaos. He understood that any weak link could destroy the fragile order that kept them all from certain death. He had to act as captain, judge, and guard, suppressing conflict so that the boat would not turn into an arena of despair. They made stops on deserted shores, hoping to find anything that could sustain them. Sometimes they managed to get a few berries or shellfish, but there were so few that their haul could not replace a full meal. They searched for traces of birds, hoping to find eggs, but more often than not, they found only empty nests. Each unsuccessful foray took away their last strength, and the cold Patagonian wind made every movement torture. At times, despair overwhelmed even the most resilient. At one point, some of the people, exhausted by the cramped conditions, cold and endless suffering, asked to be put ashore in Brazil. They chose the unknown of the wild jungle over continuing the nightmare in the boat. This decision was an act of desperation, mixed with fear and hope. Bulk, realizing the seriousness of their request, allowed them to go ashore, although his heart was heavy, for he knew that the chances of seeing them again were slim. The forest swallowed them up in a matter of minutes. Despite all the difficulties, they kept moving forward. Every mile was extremely difficult, but they knew that only movement could save their lives. Bulkeley showed incredible skill as a navigator. He guided the ship by the stars, the sun, the direction of the wind, and even the behavior of the birds that sometimes appeared above the sea. His decisions saved them from destruction more than once, and even those who had doubted him began to consider him almost a man of destiny. When after months of wandering they finally reached the Portuguese settlements in Brazil, the locals could not believe for a long time that they were looking at human beings. They looked like living ghosts. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes huge, as if they had sunk somewhere. Rags hung from their skeletal bodies and each step was difficult, as if they were carrying an invisible burden. Of the 70 people, only about 30 survived, and the appearance of each of them was like a miracle. This arrival was a triumph of human will. People who had gone through the hell of storms, hunger, and despair had accomplished the impossible, traveling thousands of miles in an open boat through the wildest waters on the planet. Their journey became one of the most impressive examples of man's ability to fight for his life to the very end. But another ordeal awaited them, returning home and facing trial, where they would have to prove the truth of their experiences and defend their names. Left on the island with a handful of loyal men, Captain Chip found himself in an even more desperate situation. They had almost no food, the boat was too small for long voyages, and the captain's health was failing. It seemed that the story was over for them, but fate had other plans. They tried to make their way north along the coast in a small yawl, but severe storms repeatedly threw them back ashore. The boat was damaged, supplies were finally exhausted, and people began to die of starvation one after another. Hope faded with each passing day. Rescue came unexpectedly in the form of local nomads, the Chono Indians. These people, perfectly adapted to life in the harsh climate, stumbled upon the camp of the dying Europeans by chance. They traveled by canoe and knew the hidden passages among the fjords. Captain Chip made a deal with the Chono chief, promising to give him a rifle in exchange for guidance to the Spanish settlements. It was a risky decision, as they were effectively surrendering to the enemy. But there was no choice. It was their only chance of survival. The journey with the Indians was incredibly difficult. The English had to row alongside the natives, carry the boats over portages, and sleep under the open sky. Chip, despite his arrogance, was forced to submit completely to the will of the guides. Relations with the Indians were tense. The Europeans did not understand their customs, and the Chonos were suspicious of strangers. Several times the guides tried to abandon the group, and only cunning and promises of reward kept them going. Finally, the exhausted group reached a Spanish outpost on the island of Chiloé. Although they were enemies in the war, the Spaniards treated the shipwrecked with unexpected nobility and compassion. They were taken prisoner, but treated more like honored guests than war criminals. They received food, clothing, and medical care, which they desperately needed. For Captain Chip, the war was over, but the struggle to restore his honor had begun. They spent several years in captivity before being allowed to return to Europe in an exchange. During this time, Chip managed to learn Spanish and rethink much of what had happened. However, his hatred for Bulkeley and his thirst for revenge continued to burn inside him. The captain's return to London caused a sensation. Everyone thought he was dead, but he came back ready to press charges against those who had abandoned him.
I cannot believe my eyes. He's alive.
The return of the survivors to England caused an unprecedented public outcry. People expected to hear about the heroism, discipline, and glory of the British fleet, as such expeditions usually became legends. But instead, the country was treated to a real scandal that shook the Admiralty, the newspapers, and the common people. The versions of events told by Bulkeley and later by Chip, who had returned, were so contradictory that society was divided into two irreconcilable camps. A war began, not at sea, but in the pages of newspapers, in tavern conversations, and in new books that sold like hotcakes. Bulkeley, realizing that he faced the gallows for mutiny and insubordination, wasted no time. He quickly prepared his diary for publication, in which he described in detail how the crew fought for their lives after the shipwreck. In the book, he portrayed himself as a decisive, courageous man, willing to sacrifice himself for others. He emphasized that it was the captain's weakness that forced him to take command. Otherwise, everyone would have died. The public liked this version of events, and the book quickly became a bestseller. In just a few weeks, Bulkeley became a folk hero, a savior whose willpower helped people survive. Chip, however, painted a completely different picture in his reports, full of betrayal and rebellion. He claimed that Bulkeley had incited the crew to mutiny solely to save his own life, and then abandoned the officers and the captain himself to die on the island. In Chip's opinion, the gunner acted like an adventurer, seeking to pass off cowardice as heroism. He demanded a court-martial and the most severe punishment, insisting that discipline had been violated in an unprecedented manner. For the captain, this case became a matter of honor and a last chance to restore his reputation. The Admiralty found itself in an extremely awkward position. On the one hand, forgiving the mutiny meant acknowledging that during a disaster, the rules could be broken without serious consequences. This set a dangerous precedent for the Navy, where strict discipline was fundamental. On the other hand, executing men who had gone through the hell of storms, hunger, and cold seemed inhumane and politically risky. Society already saw them as victims of circumstance, men who had accomplished an incredible feat of survival. Naval lawyers found an elegant and very clever solution, relying on the very legal loophole that Bulkeley had once used. They recognized that after the shipwreck, formal martial law had ceased to apply in full. This was explained by the fact that with the loss of the ship, the payment of salaries ceased, which meant that the sailors were no longer under the same direct command as they had been on board. This argument allowed their actions to be considered not as mutiny, but as a struggle for life in conditions where the laws had lost their force. The trial was long, confusing, and accompanied by constant bickering between witnesses. Officers gave testimony that often contradicted each other. Many sailors recalled events differently, and their stories were colored by trauma and personal grievances. But in the end, no one was sentenced to death. Some of the officers were acquitted completely, while others received mild reprimands that had no impact on their future careers. The Admiralty was determined to avoid further dissemination of information about the chaos that had unfolded on the island at all costs. However, the reputation of those involved in this tragedy was irrevocably destroyed. Chip never achieved the recognition he desired. His name will forever be associated with the lost ship and the crew that fell apart under his leadership. He tried to prove that he had acted correctly, but society had already decided otherwise. Bulkeley, although he escaped the noose and became a hero for a time, was also unable to continue his career. The Navy no longer trusted him, considering him a man capable of raising a mutiny at the first sign of trouble. This story divided British society and became the subject of numerous philosophical debates. Writers, scientists, and moralists discussed what happens to a person when the laws of civilization disappear. Can order exist without a harsh system of punishment? Or is man by nature prone to chaos, which is only temporarily concealed by a thin veneer of rules and norms? Discussions about this took place in universities, salons, and even on the streets. The publication of reports by Bulkeley, Chip, and other participants gave rise to a whole genre of maritime literature. People devoured stories of shipwrecks, starvation, cannibalism, power struggles, and human cruelty in survival situations. Merchants, craftsmen, students, and even officers discussed the details as if they themselves had witnessed the tragedy. The tragedy of the Wager became part of the nation's cultural code, a symbol that naval service is full not only of glory, but also of darkness. Few people realized at the time that this story would forever change society's attitude toward expeditions and naval discipline. It made people think about the price of orders, about the line between duty and the instinct for survival. And although the trial ended without executions, the aftermath of the events lingered for years. Ultimately, there were no winners in this story. Every survivor carried the trauma of the horror they had experienced with them for the rest of their lives. The sailors, officers, and captain were all broken in their own way by what they had gone through. Their bodies healed, but the memory remained. This tragedy served as a reminder of how fragile human civilization is in conditions where cold, hunger, and fear reign. We have examined this story as a chronicle of events, but its significance is much deeper. The sinking of the Wager and the mutiny that followed became a mirror that British society was afraid to look into. In this mirror, people saw how fragile their ideas of moral fortitude and civilization could be. The disaster showed that even the much-vaunted British training could disappear in a couple of weeks of hunger, cold, and despair. Behind the glamour of the great empire, the dark side of human nature, which people usually try to avoid looking at, was suddenly revealed. The story of the Wager had a huge impact on the literature and philosophy of its time. Many writers and travelers found answers to questions about human nature in it. It is believed that it was the reports of the survivors that inspired Patrick O'Brian to create his famous sea novels, where the heroes are forced to fight not only their enemies, but also themselves. Even Charles Darwin, traveling on the Beagle 100 years later, read Bulkeley's diaries as he passed through the same cold waters. He wrote that these records helped him better understand how cruel the world can be and how easily people succumb to fear. It also forced the Admiralty to revise many maritime laws, which was a rare occurrence, as the Navy traditionally adhered to the old rules. After lengthy discussions, changes were made to the charter concerning the captain's authority and the rights of the crew in the event of a shipwreck. It was now officially recognized that in extreme conditions, strict order might be impossible. The laws became more flexible, allowing for real circumstances to be taken into account, rather than just the letter of the charter. This was an important step in the development of maritime law. The psychological aspect of this drama is still relevant today, in an era when people are increasingly discussing the behavior of groups in isolation. How do people behave when cut off from familiar civilization? How are the roles of leader and subordinate distributed when old hierarchies disappear? The experience of the Voyager crew is studied by psychologists, historians, and sociologists as a classic example of social dynamics in a crisis. It shows that leadership often passes not to the one who is senior in rank, but to the one who is capable of acting decisively. This story reminds us how fragile our comfortable and orderly world is. Once the familiar frameworks and rituals are removed, people find themselves face to face with their true nature. In such moments, masks disappear, and people begin to behave as their instincts dictate. And this true nature is not always beautiful or inspiring. Sometimes it is cruel, selfish, and frighteningly simple. Today, the site of the Wager's wreck remains as wild and deserted as it was 300 years ago. The harsh winds of Patagonia remain unchanged, and the restless waters continue to crash against the rocks. The wreckage of the ship has long since disappeared beneath the water, but the memory of what happened in these places lives on in archives, diaries, and books. For many researchers, this place has become a symbol of the boundary between civilization and the primitive forces of nature, which are always ready to remind us of their presence. We often look for heroes in the past, hoping to find in them the ideals that are lacking in the present, but the story of the Wager teaches us that heroes and villains can live in the same person at the same time. Those who showed courage in one moment could show weakness in another. The choices they made were between bad and terrible, between a quick death and a difficult life. And for us, sitting in warmth and safety, it is hard to imagine what they felt and how difficult every minute of their existence was. This case shows that truth is a relative concept. Each survivor had their own truth, and each version of events reflected personal experiences, fears, and beliefs. History is never black and white. It always consists of many shades, where it is impossible to find a single correct answer. Even centuries later, researchers argue about whether Bulkeley was a savior or a rebel, whether Chip was right or blinded by ambition. The tragedy of the Wager is a lesson in humility for anyone who studies history. It reminds us that no matter how grand the Empire's plans may be, nature always has the last word. In the battle against cold, wind, and hunger, it is not the strongest who wins, but those who can adapt, who are capable of making difficult decisions and changing their beliefs. This story remains relevant because it shows the limits of human capabilities. What would you have done in the sailor's place? Would you have remained loyal to your oath and your mad captain? Or would you have chosen rebellion for the chance to see home again? The story of HMS Wager is not just a tale of a maritime disaster. It is a profound exploration of the human soul. We saw how ambition leads to destruction, how fear breaks the will, and how hope compels us to do the impossible. The survivors did not return home as triumphant heroes, but as broken men whose lives were forever left behind on the rocks of Patagonia. Their experience forces us to reflect on the price of survival and what truly makes us human. What part of this story struck you the most? Balchik's incredible swim or Captain Chip's perseverance? Suggest in the comments what other forgotten maritime tragedies you would like to hear about in future episodes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new dives into history.